Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to wrap up some of the books that I read in summer, so over July and August. I decided the way that I'm going to do these wrap up videos is not chronologically through the books that I read, but I've decided to split them up into 3 videos that are kind of thematic. This first one being all of the Jane Austen July related books that I read, even if some of them I didn't actually end up finishing in July. That is by the by. The next video will be historical fiction that I read through July and August, and then the final video will just be a miscellaneous the rest of the summer reads. But yeah, let's just get kick-started with some of the Jane Austen related books that I read. I do feel like I had a pretty successful Jane Austen July, even though I didn't do any videos towards Jane Austen July. I still feel like I took part because I feel like I read a respectable amount. In terms of Jane Austen's actual work, I reread Pride and Prejudice and Emma, which I always say are my 2 favourites. Pride and Prejudice just slightly pips Emma to the post. I know that Emma was the group pick for this month, which was not actually the reason I ended up choosing it, but because between Pride and Prejudice and Emma, those 2 are the ones that I always say are my favourites. And you may perhaps know that I'm doing my project where I am rereading old favourite books to determine which 10 will be my most favourite of all time so far. And so yeah, I definitely wanted to make sure that I had reread Pride and Prejudice and Emma, and they are just both 2 fantastic comfort reads for me at this point. I do still feel like Pride and Prejudice is my favourite. It's one that just always works, and I think it is helping me work out what makes a favourite book of all time. And I think it's that compulsion that I feel if I start reading it or start listening to the audio where I just have to keep going. Even though I know what's going to happen, I just love being in that world so much that I end up racing through to the end. And particularly every time I've done the audiobook for Pride and Prejudice, even though it is like a 10-11 hour audiobook, I end up finishing it within the day. Yes, part of that is because I listen to it on double speed, but there's like no taking my brain out of that space. And I feel like there is a really interesting difference, and I don't know what to think of it when it comes to Pride and Prejudice and Emma, where if I have an audiobook for Emma, I will listen to a little bit, I will then put it down, but then I will have the pull eventually to go back to it. And I actually ended up listening to Emma twice over July and August, just because it is a book that I know I can always go back to, and these characters are very familiar. I would just have these feelings every few days of being like, I want to listen to Emma and Mr. Knightley. I want to see what they're up to, which I think means that both of these books are favourites, but in different kinds of ways. But yeah, for me, Pride and Prejudice is the most perfect of Jane Austen's works. It's the one that I can just see no flaws in it. It is perfect. I feel like the characters are fantastic. The plotting and the pace is perfect. I love this love story. Whereas with Emma has a lot of my favourite component parts in Jane Austen's work. Emma Woodhouse is my favourite protagonist. Mr. Knightley is my favourite of her love interests. Mr. Knightley's line of, "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more," is one of my favourite lines in all of literature. I have a print of that in my office. I love it so much. Though I wonder if the reason that I don't find it quite as compulsive as Pride and Prejudice is because of that slower pace. But yeah, I love them both so much for different reasons. I'm always happy to return to them. And now getting on to books that are about Jane Austen but not written by Jane Austen. The first of those being Mrs. Wickham by Sarah Page. Now this is an Audible original, so it is only available as an audiobook. This short, I think it's only around about 2-hour audio, which provides a sequel to Pride and Prejudice through the perspective of Lydia Bennet, and is kind of a redemption arc for Lydia. The conceit for this being really drumming up sympathy for Lydia as she finds herself a young wife in a loveless marriage, far away from all of her family have turned their backs on her, and how she is able to pull herself out of this situation and assert more independence, a kind of coming of age in adversity, which involves setting up her own business, making friends up north, and trying to straighten out her wayward husband. It's narrated by Jessie Buckley as Lydia Bennet and then Johnny Flynn, who ends up playing Mr. Wickham. I do think it is really, really well performed. The issue that I have with this is that while I can, in theory, feel a lot of sympathy for Lydia, I definitely do feel a lot of sympathy for Lydia. You know, she's 15 years old and was basically entrapped by this man who had form for attempting abduction and trying to elope with teenagers. I did feel ultimately like the way that Sarah Page ended up characterising the figures from Pride and Prejudice that we know and love just really went against what we actually know about them. And there are lots of things in this that just contradict the original Pride and Prejudice in a way that makes me think, did Sarah Page read this before she started writing, or was this just like a concept she had in her mind and she just ran with it without double checking first all of her facts? I feel like it characterises Lydia and Wickham as, you know, a bad girl meets a bad boy and they run off together, rather than what it was, which was a lot more predatory. And I think it's really, really telling that not once in this 2-3 hour audiobook is Georgiana Darcy even mentioned, because when you factor not just Lydia but also Georgiana in there, you cannot make Mr. Wickham redeemable. I feel like it's a glaring omission that she is there, and kind of an admittance by the author that the only way to do a redemption arc for Mr. Wickham is to completely erase that part of his history. And the characterization that she is trying to make for him is that instead of being an actual predator against teenage girls, you know, he's just a drunken bad boy. He just needs to be straightened out by the right woman. And I feel like every character in Pride and Prejudice has to be refashioned and reworked in some way to make this narrative work. And certain features about them that are mentioned in Pride and Prejudice are just completely ignored here. Lydia nostalgically reflecting that her mother's love for her came without conditions. I mean, did it? Maybe not internally, but a lot of her external love definitely came with conditions, that her daughters did behave and do what she wanted them to do. I know that doesn't mean necessarily that she didn't love them inside, but in terms of the affection that they are shown, I definitely feel like that came with conditions. The idea that Mr. Bennet wouldn't want to move as far as Pemberley, the final chapter of Pride and Prejudice completely contradicts this, and he travels to Pemberley frequently to get away from Longbourn. I am going to give a slight plot spoiler for Mrs. Wickham, so if you don't want to hear that, I would say skip to this time. But at the end of this book, Mrs. Bennet dies, and the five sisters all come together to discuss what they are going to do with Mr. Bennet now that he doesn't have his wife there. And the idea that Lizzie and Jane would not immediately offer to put up Mr. Bennet just seems completely foreign to me, and it feels so constructed, so manufactured, so that Lydia jumps in and says, no, I'm going to look after my father. Like, to me, with the characterizations we have in Pride and Prejudice, it makes no sense that Lizzie and Jane would not immediately offer to do that. The idea that Lizzie and Jane refuse to give money to the Wickhams, absolutely completely false. If you look at the final chapter of Pride and Prejudice, they were frequently giving them money, but it's done to drum up sympathy for Lydia and Wickham and to feel like their sisters and not giving them their dues. You know, the ultimate message of this book is second chances, of not judging people on their early actions, giving them a chance to have a redemption rather than just writing them off completely, which I totally get and I support. Maybe not for Mr. Wickham, but definitely for Lydia. However, I do think it is really telling that so much of Pride and Prejudice has to be rewritten and reworked to make this story believable. I have a similar issue with Longbourn. I feel like Jo Baker had to do a lot of editing and a lot of reworking of these characters to massage them into the plot that she wanted to force them down, and I just find that cynical. I feel like there are plenty of good Pride and Prejudice retellings that look at somebody else's perspective in the narrative aside from Lizzie's and Mr. Darcy's and manage to make it work and make these characters feel like Jane Austen's. I'm glad I listened to it. You know, it's only 2 hours long, so if you are curious, you're not really losing much in the way of time by listening to it. But yeah, I definitely had issues with this. Next up, I read my first graphic novel in quite a while, and I read The Novel Life of Jane Austen, a graphic biography by Janine Barchas, illustrated by Isabel Greenberg, who I have previously read her Gaia and Athena graphic novels, as well as her graphic novels on the life of the Brontes. I actually ended up picking my copy of this out from the library and had a good time with this. This is basically, as the title suggests, just giving a graphic history of Jane Austen's life. From Jane as a teenager going to Bath for the first time, we get insight into her family life, into different settings and surroundings of her life, and how these things may have inspired her novels. There are lots of fun little Easter eggs and references to her works. We see this young woman growing confidence in her writing. There's clearly a lot of love for Jane Austen in this graphic novel. I feel like in terms of the illustration style, if you've read any other of Isabel Greenberg's illustrated works, you'll get a sense of whether this art style appeals to you. For me, I found this to be good fun. I think it's a nice little primer for Jane Austen. As I say, I took it out of the library and I don't think this is going to be one that I add to my permanent collection. I don't think I'll be coming back to it, but was a nice fun thing to break up my reading. And then the last Jane Austen July influenced book that I ended up reading, I actually did as a buddy read alongside Katie over at Books and Things and Roz from Skelly Dandling about the books, and it was Jane Austen's Bookshelf, The Women Writers Who Shaped a Legend by Rebecca Romney. I was really heartened to see how many people were actually reading this for Jane Austen July. We didn't do this as like a public read along, but so many other people were also reading this at the same time. And this is non-fiction history about the different women writers who would have inspired Jane Austen's works, the writers she would have read, whose plots, whose prose would have inspired her, from Frances Burney to Anne Radcliffe to Hester Frale, as well as ones that I didn't know so much about like Charlotte Smith and Elizabeth Inchbald. I did know a decent amount about some of these authors because for my masters I actually did a module on representing women in the 18th century, and we did have a week that was about women writers, which is where I first read Frances Burney's Evelina. Also, after reading Blue Stockings last year, I was reacquainted with figures like Hannah More, Moore and Hester Frail-Piozzi. Rebecca Romney is actually an antique book collector who has a lot of experience bidding on and also auctioning off classic works from the 18th and 19th century, and admits that she had always presumed that the reason that Jane Austen is so well known and these other figures, these other women writers who preceded her and not, was simply because they weren't very good, and that's why we haven't remembered them. And in this book, as she starts to learn more about them and read more, reading both biographies and their works, she realises that there has been a lot of suppression of these figures in their times, and particularly in the 19th century. And maybe the reason that we are so familiar with Jane Austen and we know so much about her, and she is so lauded, is because she actually had people in her life who, after her death, were still supporting her and keeping attention on her. For example, Jane Austen's nephew, who wrote her biography and kept her name in the public consciousness in a way that a lot of these other figures just didn't have. And especially because the Victorians especially were so damning of a lot of the antics of the 18th century, which also extends to some of its famous figures like its writers. And it was just simply easier to fit Jane Austen into a more Victorian friendly box than some of these women. I really enjoyed reading this. I especially loved Buddy reading it with Katie and Roz, getting some of their insights. I think we were feeling quite inspired to pick up some of these authors, and in fact I have started on The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anna Radcliffe. As I say, I've read Evelina, but I've not read anything else by Frances Burney. She's always been an author that I've been like, yeah, I'll come back to her at some point, and I just never have. So this is definitely giving me a kick in the right direction to read some more of these 18th century writers who inspired my favourite writer. So there we go, those are all of the Jane Austen July related books I read. Do let me know if you've read any of these books. Please let me know your favourite Jane Austen book, as well as your favourite related thing to do with Jane Austen, whether it is a retelling of her work or a non-fiction about her. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.